This meeting is being recorded.
Hi everyone, welcome to OLM community meeting. Today is February 25th, 2025. And Let me share my screen. And Today's agenda, we have a brief about the benchmarking test in OLM V1. We have authors are Jiang and Daniel. Daniel, are you here?
Lala, this is a downstream brief.
Okay, so we shouldn't mark it. I'll remove it from here. I'm not sure who added it.
I will say there are a lot of upstream factors to it, but there are um, downstream components as well. So that's probably why it got added because it is mostly um, or an upstream effort. Um,
Do
so
you
it is
want
probably
to?
worth discussing at some
Yeah,
point. But
yeah. Once you are ready, you feel free to add it back. I think my understanding is we want to do the benchmarking in upstream repos, right?
yes, yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So yeah, once you are ready, you can add it back, and we can definitely discuss this. Thanks.
Sure, yeah.
Cool. Moving to the next topic, we have a topic from Taylor and Brett about airbag authorizer library. Do you want to talk about this, Taylor,
Yeah,
Brett?
the only problem is Joe's had a lot to say about this as
Okay.
recently as a few minutes ago on
Yeah.
chat, and he's not here yet.
Okay.
Or maybe he's not coming, I don't know which, but it would be good to either wait for him or maybe postpone it.
We
Or
can, yeah, we can definitely wait for, I mean, we can go through the other topics and then come back to this.
sure.
So no worries. The next one is from Todd about updating copyright years on files. Yes, no, maybe. Todd, do you want to talk about
Yeah,
this one?
so I can start. So in a recent PR, I accidentally put in the year 2024 because I created a new file and I copied the big old header at the top, the Apache copyright notice, and put it in the file, but it was dated 2024. Where now for those who are awake, it is 2025. Or those who are asleep, it's 2025 now. Um, So the question is, do we want to update the copyright when we modify files? Um, I One could argue that yes, we should, because every update we make is a new change, and that therefore renews the copyright. One could argue no, we should just have the copyright of when the file was originally put in, for when the file was originally created. I know lots of open source projects have wrestled with this. When I was doing a lot of work with OpenSSL, every January and February, as files started being touched, there were tons of copyright updates because it's like, oh, it's a new year and now I'm touching this file afresh, so I have to update the copyright. So we currently do not have a copyright policy. And I'm just wondering if we should, and if we do want to have one, should we update what should be the policy? Should we update the year? Should we leave it as the original file creation date, etc.?
Right. So I'm not a lawyer, just a disclaimer that I'm also, so when I saw the PR, I was curious about whether we should update the years or not, and I stumbled upon um, some internet posts, right? And I think in general, the idea is the year you put in a file, so that's the time the copyright basically starts. So when you,
Right, but so the thing is, what you do is you actually specify a range. You say it is copyrighted, 2024 through 2025, so that the
right,
last copyright date is the date. Um, and technically, you don't do a range. You actually add the year to a list of years, because there may be cases where you do not modify a year somehow, that you do not modify a file.
Yes.
And we are all not lawyers. And that thing you posted, Lala, which I did look through, I don't think any of them are lawyers either.
I was gonna
So
ask, can I take a step back and ask, what are the implications? What is the implication of having 1 year versus the other? What is it like coming from someone who's always seen those lines but never investigated or never like went deeper into what they actually mean? What is the implication of having 1994 and 2025?
so
Go ahead.
I mean, at least my understanding is if it is a work for hire, which is what we are, the copyright date is based on basically the last update plus X and is valid for X years. I mean, we've all heard that Mickey Mouse the version of Mickey Mouse in Steamboat Willie is now public domain. However, the version of Mickey Mouse in something that was created a year after that is not in the public domain. So all this is technically work for hire as far as I'm concerned. So it is valid for X number of years, which means that if we don't update the copyright, so from 1994 to say 2024, just to keep that a nice even 30 years, it means that the copyright period is 30 years less than it could be. If we were making individual pieces of code that we are not being paid for, or a piece of art or something along those lines, the copyright is typically your lifetime plus X number of years, which I believe is 70, but I could be wrong there. Don't quote me. So work for hire copyright, which is what we are working on, has different copyright rules than personal stuff. So the copyright year, updating that copyright year actually matters.
Does Kubernetes have any guidance on this?
Does what?
Kubernetes is a project like, we are, we're a CNCF
That's a
project,
good
right?
question.
CNCF
That's a good
project.
question.
Yeah, so I think CNCF should have some guidance on this.
Google might, CNCF might.
They actually has. I saw that. I lost the link, and all projects that are donated for CNFC, what usually they use is the Easy CLA, because then when you do a pull request, you sign a term and you say that no matter what, that the code is no longer yours, right? It's for the project.
Right. It's
Right.
work for hire, as is the term, at least in the United States.
Let's see if I find the links here.
Joe has
I'm
his
looking
hands
at the
up.
foundation charter, and there is an intellectual property policy, which is about G bullet points, however many letters G is.
This question on updating copyright years and files came up very early on when I joined the operator SDK team. And the guidance we got then was don't ever update copyright years in files that already exist. Only ever, when you create a new file, put the current year in the new file.
So I've heard, again, like I said, I mentioned the OpenSSL project as an example. They update the file. They update the year of the file every year it's modified. So there are definitely different opinions here.
Yeah, I don't know that it matters that much, to be honest. Like, as long as every file has a year in it that
Here's my question. Will we care in 100 years?
No.
I
90
think
years.
I think maybe it's valid, Joe, because I think maybe if you put like the copyrights in, I don't know, 24, right? That I don't know. We can check that, but I'm assume my bet here is that copyright is valid for that year, because that many projects put a range, like Todd told, right? That
mean,
license is valid for that.
No, it's not. That is
Yes.
not what copyright is. Copyright is indicating the copyright year indicates the date the piece of artwork was created, and that means that is when the protection starts. The protection is good for, I believe, 100 years, because that's, the whole Mickey Mouse thing, or maybe it's 95 years or something along those lines. And that's how long it is. It's not just for the period of the years that you specify. It's basically indicating a start point and renewals, effectively.
Yeah. I suspect that all of this it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really make sense to have a year on a file. If you care about, like, if someone's going to claim copyright or claim that a copyright is no longer relevant, they're going to have to find when that particular piece of code or whatever it is that they want to copy was added. And so if the file header says 2024, but the first 300 lines of the file haven't been changed since 2022, then the first 300 lines are 2022. Like, there's no way that you can just claim that you can renew your copyright just by
I'm not
bumping
so
it.
sure about
Well,
that.
I'm pretty sure that copyright is automatic.
It
Like, the
is.
years don't actually matter. It's just
Yeah.
reference for other people. Like, it's not going to be. You don't have to like even put years anymore. I put like this link of the Linux Foundation's recommendations, and like you just don't really even need to worry about it. I mean, you can. It's like informational, really, but it's not like it's gonna result in anything getting violated or anything.
However, I think that may apply may not apply to works for hire.
I think we should just
because if you have a personal copyright, like, oh, I wrote this email and this email is copyrighted, that is copyrighted based upon your lifespan plus X number of years, not when it was created.
I think
But it's
the
obviously
right course
no
of
one's
action here is for us just to go ask either CNCF or Red Hat legal and have them tell us what to do. Like, I don't think we're going to figure out an answer amongst ourselves here.
Yeah, I completely agree. This is definitely a topic which is beyond.
I just linked to the CNCF charter, which has their IP policy, and they basically say they don't say anything, which is kind of surprising.
Yeah.
I think Joe, that was what I think as well, right? We have the legal team in Red Hat to just send an email, put it like an action item, send an email to them and ask if you. But if you should update, then I think it needs to be automatically, right? And that's done.
Yeah, I think let's ask the team, and then basically, I think Todd, do you want to do that? I have reached out to legal team before in my previous projects about some licensing changes, so I can help you a little bit, point towards the right email addresses, things like that.
I can certainly put out some feelers.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, let's check back on that. Cool. So moving to the next topic, which Joe, actually we were waiting for you, so we waited for you to join, and then we wanted to discuss this one. Brett and Taylor has a topic about RBAC authorizer library. Brett, do you want to go now?
Yeah, sure. So we might have kind of covered this up in the discussion, but we're thinking about using a call to a library RBAC authorizer. Essentially part or all of, probably just part of the work of the pre-flight permissions check can be done with a call to this. And yeah, that's probably enough background on it. So I think the question is, it has some pros and cons, and it's probably worth discussing. But I think maybe the best bet would be to because Joe actually did a little bit of research since I put this on the agenda, so it might be worth just asking Joe what the results of that are.
Yeah. Um, so we need to, let's see. We basically want to do the full check that would happen when applying a set of manifests to a cluster in order, the same way that the Kubernetes API server is going to check from an RBAC standpoint. There are sort of two different checks that happen depending on what the object type is. So the most common thing that I'm sure everyone is familiar with is, do you have, like, say you want to create a deployment, you have to have create deployment permission in the namespace where you want to create your deployment. So there's sort of the first pass check, which is simply, do you have the right verbs for this group resource and potentially sub-resource and potentially resource name, but that's sort of details. So there's like this one check, which is just like, do you have the right verbs on this resource type? That check applies to all Kubernetes APIs. There's a separate check that happens specifically when you're trying to create or update RBAC objects, which is this escalation check. That check only happens in the storage layer of RBAC. So it doesn't happen in admission, it happens later at the storage layer. That check says, oh, if you want to create a role, then you have to have all of the rules that are in the role, or you have to have the escalate verb on roles, or you have to be a system master. And there's a specific check for system master in the code that checks for this. And then there's same for cluster roles, except you have to have your own permissions for cluster wide. And then there's a similar check for role bindings and cluster role bindings. But for those, it dereferences the role ref and goes and looks up the rules there and checks that you have those rules. So that's all well and good. So you sort of have a few options, right? Clearly, so thinking about like how we would actually invoke this stuff, the RBAC authorizer and self-subject access review are essentially the exact same thing. You get the same answer. It's basically the same input into both of those. Neither of those give you this escalation check. So we need to use either RBAC authorizer or SSAR, but that's still not enough. So for the second level of stuff, we have to figure out how to get the escalation check to happen. Theoretically, there's two ways of doing that, but I think practically there's probably only one. So theoretically, the two ways are, well, let's do a dry run, a server-side dry run, create or update. And the way to really do that is probably a server-side apply as a patch, and then the server figures out whether it's a create or an update, and you get the right code running for you. The other way is to essentially take all of the code that runs during those create or update calls and call them ourselves locally. And when we call them locally, we'd have to have a cache of all of the RBAC objects so that we could do the rules evaluations. Unfortunately, I was thinking, well, I don't want to do all of this locally. There's a lot of code there. It's potential for, things getting out of sync or for us to miss something. There are edge cases. So as I was researching this, the first thing I tried was, let's just do server-side apply dry run, which almost works, except it doesn't work in the case of cluster role bindings and role bindings that reference cluster roles or roles that are in the manifest. So if you think about it, like if you try to dry run everything, it can tell you like, oh yeah, okay, these cluster roles and roles, I see what the rules are, therefore I can evaluate if you already have those rules. Great. The problem with the bindings is that the role refs don't actually exist on the cluster yet if they're referencing other things that are in the manifest. And in the case of registry v1 bundles, that will almost always be the case. So in that case, when it tries to dry run a binding, it comes back and says this role or cluster role just doesn't exist. So I can't do the escalation check for you. So once I saw that, it's like, oh crap. Well, dry run won't work. The only other way to do this then is to evaluate the rules locally. So I've got a PR up that does everything locally. And then so my conclusion was, well, to do the escalation check and to include the local context of the cluster roles and roles that might show up in the manifest that are going to be referenced by bindings that are in the manifest, we need to have all the RBAC cached locally. And since we have it all cached locally, we might as well then go back to the question of RBAC authorizer versus SSAR. And we probably should just then use the RBAC authorizer because we already have it all cached locally. So we've already paid the cost for that. And it'll be a lot more performant to use that over SSAR. So the PR that I made that's in draft mode, threw it together, does everything locally using a former cache. So that's the background. Yeah, it's not great. The obvious downside is like if you go look at the draft PR I put up, I had to copy a bunch of Kubernetes code into our repo. We could do go.mod changes and actually include kates.io/Kubernetes. But when you do that, it causes a whole bunch of like really terrible, you have to do a bunch of replaces with some of the stuff because of the way that the kates.io Kubernetes repo works with its staging directories. Yeah. So I don't know what else to say. It's not a great spot, but sort of the best one I came up with when I was looking into it. I don't know if there's also, Taylor, I saw you mention self-subject rules review and Camilla. Yeah, you basically ask, give me the rules for this user in this namespace. And the rules it gives back are everything for that namespace and all the cluster rules. So you get the cluster rules every single time you ask, no matter where you are. But that doesn't really help us. That would just be a different way of getting access to all the RBAC, essentially. That would be sort of a different way of quote unquote populating our cache of RBAC, where you wouldn't necessarily have to maintain a cache all the time. You could make this query every time instead. If we did that, we would have to query for every single namespace in which, like if our manifest has 10 objects in it and there are 10 different objects in the namespace, there are 10 different namespaces among those objects, we'd have to do 10 SSRR requests, which is certainly better than however many self-subject access reviews requests we would have to make. But it's still like, at the end of the day, SSAR doesn't do the escalation check, so it's not enough anyway. All right. I think that's all I got. Yeah, I'm curious what people think about all this.
Well, we've been bouncing around a little bit on, what I mean, when the SSRR, the self-subject rules review, seems to have a downside of only being RBAC related, right? So if there were other authentication schemes that picked up speed, then it wouldn't apply. That wouldn't work. That's one of the main objections there, right?
Yes. With self-subject access review, you'll get whatever authorizers happen to be included. Self-subject rules review is just going to give you RBAC. If we are using, yeah, the only way to get so again, so going back to like, there's two different phases, tiers of this. One is the sort of the access review, and the next one is the escalation check.
Yep.
SSAR is better than RBAC authorizer in that case that you're talking about, Brett, because SSAR gives you whatever authorizers are actually configured on the cluster rather than just our assumption that it's RBAC.
Right.
For the escalation check, if it's not RBAC, then it's just something totally different that we don't know about. And we would have to basically know in advance somehow what authorizers were used and whether those authorizers had extra escalation checks built into them if they have like cluster resources that represent their stuff. So it's like, so if you think about it, it's like, all right, well, the only time we have to do the escalation check is if we encounter an RBAC object in our manifest. So if tomorrow someone says, here's a bundle that has, XYZ back objects, we don't know what those are. So the only thing we would ever do with those is do sort of the preliminary, does someone have CRUD on XYZ XYZ back objects? And we could do that check. But if we don't know that there's also this back end escalation check that happens with XYZ back objects, then what will probably happen is we just won't run those, and then we'll actually try to do a real install or a real update, and then those would fail. Which maybe is the best we can do until we know that those are a thing, and then we'd have to go and try to code support for that.
So Joe, you are suggesting that instead of RBAC authorizer, we should use the SSAR?
No. I think what I'm saying, if we go with a fully local check where we use RBAC authorizer and we do our own implementation of check escalation, what we could say is we don't care what the cluster uses for its authorizers. However, for cluster extensions and for the service accounts cluster extensions, no, we can't quite say that. I guess we could say like, we expect you to use RBAC because that's what we're going to do pre-flight checks for.
And we do the local, we have to implement code for our escalation check.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I mean, we have to also write code for doing escalation check locally.
I think we have to do that no matter what. I don't see a way that we can avoid that.
I guess your PR does that, right? I haven't taken a look
It
into your
does.
PR.
Yeah.
Okay.
And most of that code is copy paste from Kubernetes. So there's not a whole lot more that needed to be custom written. It's basically like most of that PR is really just like pulling the right files out of the Kubernetes repo and then writing just some fairly light wrappers. I mean, you'll see if we go in and look at it, there's still probably a couple hundred lines of custom code that sort of wraps and integrates the RBAC checking logic in with the Helm applier, but it's not a ton. Most of the complex logic is happening just in the code that gets copied in. So I mean, my conclusion is like, this seems like it works and it does everything that it needs to do related to RBAC, although I don't know for sure yet, but I was just sort of manually spot checking it, and a few differences came in that I still haven't looked into. That may mean that there's either a little bug that I have or I'm not interpreting something correctly. But in general, it seems like it works and it's very fast. Yeah. This feels like something that Like I know Taylor, you started that thread in SIG-auth, but no one else has responded to it. So it's like, okay, well, maybe we should go ask somewhere else. Maybe like in, I don't know where else we would even ask, but this feels like a discussion that we should have with, others on the control plane side to see. And I feel like I've brought this up with David Eads at least once. And he didn't immediately, I mean, the concept at least, not the specifics that we're talking about here, but he seemed to think that it was not an unreasonable thing to do. So maybe we need to sort of write up some of these more specifics of what we found. Both like, well, here, if we did SSAR, then we get these benefits, but we lose out on this, or we'd have these performance implications. We need to do these escalation checks anyway. That like those are not really accessible in libraries. We had to copy some code around. Like we might just want to write down like here's sort of where we are, and we don't have confidence ourselves to decide where to take this without getting some control plane folks to help answer some questions.
Uh, But just to summarize, Joe, to see if we understand, right? I put in the chat as well, right? Okay, we did the SSR stuff. We use the Kubernetes API to do the check to see if it has or not the permissions. All works fine, but we are unable to check the escalating the bind verbs for the service account, right? Then because of that you did the POC and you like wrap the Kubernetes API to get this specific information and you do like you get from you are using the local cache and you do like a dry run because you told that you apply the stuff on the cluster and then if it fails we know that it has no the permissions. If it passes we have the permissions.
So dry run almost works, but it doesn't work in the case of a binding that has a reference to one of the other roles or cluster roles that's in the manifest itself. That's the problem with the server-side dry run. Because
Okay.
you're basically doing one of them at a time, right? So you're not applying any of it for real. You do one request at a time. When you get to the role binding or the cluster role binding, you say, hey, server, try creating this, do a dry run for it. It references a role or a cluster role that doesn't exist. And that causes the check not to be able to work, right? Because it doesn't know what rules are associated with that binding, so it can't tell whether it's an escalation or not.
I got that. So then your POC, you are able to do that because you are like a copy and paste Kubernetes API code, and then you are able to check the things, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not that is not exposed by the API, right?
Yeah. So
But
the way that the POC works, yeah, so those are not exposed. They're not in they're not in any of like the API machinery or API server libraries. They're in kates.io/Kubernetes, which is really terrible to import. And I think we should avoid it if we really can. They are technically importable from there. So we could have an import for kates.io/Kubernetes/whatever. Our go.mod file would become extremely ugly. So I really don't want to do that because it just becomes a massive pain.
we can only it's only small pieces of code, right? We can copy and make a comment. That came from this place.
Yeah, I think if
Yeah.
you look at the PR, you'll see that it's maybe like 10 to 15 files that had to be copied in. So it's not a whole lot. I did modify some of the files, uh, which I think we will have to do if we want to have structured rules in our status. the escalation check does not tell you what the missing rules are. It just returns an error. And the error is just literally just errors.new with a string that they build based on all the missing rules. So you'd have to parse it, which I don't think we should do. So some of this stuff I think is like, I was looking at it, it's like, okay, I can make this change. I can add a new error type. I can populate specific missing rules and other things in it. And then I can return that from this thing as an error. The error type string still matches what that string build does right now. So like some of these would be potentially backwards compatible changes that we could go and suggest up in the Kubernetes repo so that we wouldn't have to maintain those patches. So that would be sort of another thing that I'd want to go and ask, like, could we make this an actual error type rather than a string and then be able to do stuff with it on the other side? But yeah,
So,
so at the end of the day, like my PR, in fact, I was trying to rebase it a little bit today to make it sort of obvious how this all builds. But I'm going to push something hopefully fairly soon where it's like the first commit is just like copy the files in, second commit modifies them based on the modifications that I thought we probably would need. And then the third and subsequent commits go and start adding our implementation of the wrapper around it. So it's not terrible once it's all working, and we probably wouldn't have to modify the Kubernetes stuff much, if at all. But the problem there would be if that code changes, how would we know about it? And we would want to pull that code in, most likely.
so basically, use the local cache. With your POC, we discovered that using the local cache is better because it has a better performance, right? So Ng also allows to solve the challenge of the escalating the bind verbs. So
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
that is the pros. The cons with the solution, what we are concerned about is how we keep that maintained because we are copying the paste code from Kubernetes. Is 15 is not too much, but if it changes something there, what we do, how you'll be aware of, we need to ensure that every time that we bump control runtime, that stuff is still working with a new version of Kubernetes, all this stuff. So if it's possible to contribute with that, or if the folks has other place that we can put that as an API and we start to use.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in my ideal world, I would say like, all right, we should do this as a library because that's the only way we're going to get the escalation checks. So we go forward with that. We go talk to Kubernetes maintainers. Maybe we can put this code in one of the staging directories and have it synced out someplace that we could then import from. And then, so that would be one thing that we would want to suggest. The other thing that we'd want to suggest is this like permission escalation error type thing that would help us have more structured understanding of what the missing rules are. So both of those changes were, oh, and another thing that I changed was, and we could probably do this ourselves. We wouldn't have to put this in their code if we didn't want to. Another thing I changed was they have a helper function that knows how to take a set of policy rules and essentially compact them. So for the most part, it's like, oh, if I see one rule that has this resource and group and another rule that has the same resource and group, I can fold their verbs together. But their code for some reason like duplicates verbs. So I updated some of that code there to dedupe and to handle the star verb. But yeah, there's stuff like that that we could potentially do other things with. My conclusion again is there's no way to do this with pure server queries. We have to have code. Either they need to create a whole new API that lets us do this, which seems probably not likely, or we have to run the escalation code ourselves. So at the end of the day, I think that's probably where we're sitting, is running the escalation code ourselves. ideally, then we'll be able to go back and say, well, it's not great that the escalation code is only present in Kates.io/Kubernetes. Can we move it around somewhere to make it easier? And then we have the conversations about some of the other changes too. But I would say, like, for right now, that like none of that happens quickly. So we'll probably, seems like if we're going to go down this path, we'll just have to basically do something along the lines of what that draft PR that I put up does.
I think if you want to propose that, like for a machinery API, right, something like that, we would need to do a PEP, a design doc, put the reasons for, and whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah. And before I went to the work of writing all that up, I'd go and talk to David basically and be like, what are the chances that something like this would be accepted? But I don't know that we should, like, that should be a thing that once, I think we should talk about some of these alternatives in a little more depth, specifically like with Taylor and Brett, and see what you guys think. Once we get consensus on like which direction we're going to take, I think we probably would want to go back to the RFC and clarify, here's exactly how we're going to do this now that we have more information about the various options. List the alternatives that we looked at and discarded, and then I can take that over to the control plane team and say, okay, guys, I need you guys to review this and give me some feedback on what we should do. Is this a good path? Can we go and suggest some changes up in Kubernetes to make this easier? Blah, blah, blah.
But maybe I missed something. Understand what you are putting. I think we have not too much to decide, right? More like we follow your POC approach, and then the next step is only like how we can put it in other place, and also before we it's a feature flagged, right? But also when we have the implementation in a better way, we pick David Eads and see if he has any concern about the code, something like that.
Yeah, but I still think we should have what we think is the best path based on everything that Brett Taylor and I have learned. Have that written down before we go and actually commit to it. We should go talk to the control plane folks to see if there's anything that we're missing, not understanding.
But before we talk with them, we need the change in a pull request at least, right? To try to make
Yeah,
it
yeah,
clear.
or at
Yeah.
least the RFC to go into enough detail that the same point is made.
Yeah, I think what I heard is just basically implement some along the lines of the POC, but the problem with that is that there's a lot of copied code in there. So to deal with that more long term, we want to document what what we thought about and rejected, and that's basically the piece that's missing from the RFC, like what was thought about and what was rejected and why, and take that chunk of the RFC over to somebody who thinks that we could maybe deal with the copied code better by updating Kubernetes itself to work the way essentially the tweaks that we're doing in the copied code, we would be proposing to make it work that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the extra piece of work here is just that the RFC is tweaked such that it actually documents this process and can be used as sort of a place to talk about whether that might actually get any traction and really change Kubernetes, or whether we probably maybe want to roll it into sort of maybe a library ourselves for maintenance, so that we are at least aware that like the if we kind of have it broken out ourselves, we at least have awareness of what we're tracking against. So
Yeah, the other thing that, and I know we've probably touched on this in the RFC, but now that we know that like the escalation check is RBAC specific, which obviously would have to be because it's looking at RBAC rules, like I think that's this open question too, because on the SSAR side, we've been talking about If we use that, then we get to ride on whatever authorizers are configured on the cluster. If we don't, we're sort of assuming RBAC. On this escalation side, we sort of have the same questions, which is like, well, if we just assume RBAC, yeah, we know how to do that. But if it's some other authorizer, then it's unknown what the escalation checks are. So then, how do we deal with that? I suspect that the answer from the control plane team is going to come back and say, that's fine just to assume RBAC. And we'll just write that down as our documentation as like we assume RBAC. And if other authorizers are in use, that's a feature request. Go and ask us to implement a new pre-check for whatever other authorizer it is.
All right, well, I have enough to be able to pursue. Taylor, you think we have enough to be able to make progress?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. We just kind of want to pursue the path forward that was presented in Joe's POC, like draft PR, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, my feeling, I think, is so we've got this, so we've sort of got two, not competing, but like two coinciding things we're trying to do. One is we just want to improve the UX so that people know what rules they need to set up on their permission, on their service account.
Yeah.
That, in my opinion, we can be very diligent about and make sure that we get all of that working well and has a nice UX. However, the other thing that coincides with this is we right now don't have this pre-flight check. And in cases where the service account doesn't have the right rules, the Helm install or update fails, and that causes problems potentially for retrying. And that seems like a more urgent issue that we need to have. In my mind, it's maybe not necessarily a bug, but it's borderline bug if we can't handle it on a retry. So that feels like we need something in place fairly quickly. So I don't think that any of this discussion of like, oh, let's go talk to the control plane folks, blah, blah, blah. Ideally, those can like that's more along the side of like, let's improve the UX. I think we should probably try to push forward with something that doesn't change our API at all, that at least gives us better confidence that the actual installer upgrade won't fail.
I think if I remember properly, when we discussed the RFC, right, the proposal, we one of the conveys was like not to change the API at all. Like it is nice if things maybe could be in a tooling. We don't
Yeah.
know if it'll be nice in the CRG because of the size of the output. It'll be too verbose. We don't know. So I think I think I get what you mean, right? My concern is like if I think the challenge, I think that is the best word. The challenge is how we put this information for the DVDs into the control planes, right? Because if we came with our use, so maybe I think the better approach, what I was thinking was what you're saying, right? Take your POC, refine the stuff, put the code, at least for us in a PR, I don't know. And then we have the solution, right? Maybe it's easier if we get that solution and just say, we need cheese and cheese permissions, we need cheese input and cheese output, and we don't have, so we are doing this way. Then provide a lot of details because you'll not have the time, the effort to consume. If they don't get fast, we don't you have that will take time, right? So as easier we can share the detail, what we need from them is more fast and easier you'll get their help.
We can also update the RFC with this question and ask them to review as well, right? That different way we can get feedback from control room folks. But
I think David jumped there, right? But he made questions that I had in the first moment when I saw, because when I saw, I didn't know that all permissions were fixed. So in my mind, it was like, how you discover the permissions, right? So it has a lot of context about operator lifecycle manage that the person needs know to
right.
consume documents. So that is the problem, because he needs consume so many documents per day, right? Has so many people asking help. So I think the best approach, in my humble opinion, how I would do that is like try to abstract all operator lifecycle manager concepts and ideas and actually say we need the information A and B and C, and we are trying to do in this way. Look at the PR, right? Because then he can see the code. But we are copy and paste from this place, like Joe explained. And the output X has a better way, has another place. Can you put in the machinery API? Something like that, right?
Yeah, I think that's something we can discuss. You guys can sync offline and figure it out. Like Joe said, we anyway has to do improve our UX, and then in parallel we need to talk with control room folks. So I assume we can figure this out in offline. It's because we're reaching end of the meeting. So is that okay if we move to the next topic?
I
Yep.
think, yeah. I think we don't have another topic, right? Finish the meeting.
We have a roadmap check-in we didn't do last week. So I wanted to make sure that the board is up to date. So for example, here I can see the first column on the right hand side is catalog the web interface performance improvements need doc. Is it still right, or have we finished the documentation? Anybody know?
No, I don't think we started writing the documentation, so it's still correct. Needs docs.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Sunny. On the implementing, we have the kubectl operator plugin updates, permission validation, pre-flight check, and then post-mono repo integration. Page 1. And in the designing part, we have performance and scale, registry view and bundle illustration, single namespace. I think this is implementing, right? I should move it to implementing because pay as PR is almost, I think, going to merge soon. So moved it to implement.
PR is just one aspect of it, but it is technically implementing. But just thing merges, that doesn't mean we're done.
Yeah, this is one aspect of it. Yeah, but we have started implementing the Epic.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think the next step is still the PR using the annotation, and you probably want to change the API to receive the namespace, right? And then we need to decide how you will do APIs, like if you want beta 1, like how you will generate an API with feature gates. I think that is a block.
Yes, that's yet another aspect, but at least for now, Nico is working on a brief to decide how to set up the cluster extension API to be able to pass parameters through. So that is the thing that would get the namespace out of the annotation and into something more official. But then, yes, you're right. There's this other question of if and how to manage APIs in the CRD that are not GA. So we haven't gotten to that question yet, but I don't think any of this work is really blocked on that. The first time we want to actually merge an API change that's tech preview only, we'll have to talk about it. But I think we can decide what we want the APIs to be before we figure out how to introduce them, basically.
Is there anything on the designing side? Like right now, currently on the designing column, we have 1.0.0 performance and scale. And the no status section, we have help admins determine necessary permission from bundle lifecycling, support registry v1 bundles that include CSV with webhook definitions.
I
And
think
those are the God, Joe,
log
sorry.
number 381 there at the bottom is probably designing. That's basically the thing that I just said Nico is working on a brief on.
All right. Okay. Cool. And I think let me check if it is assigned to Nico or not. If not, then we can assign him, right?
Yeah.
And this one is already assigned to someone, so all good. So this one, I'm going to change it to assign to Ankita. Sorry. Yeah, I don't, yeah. Okay. What did I miss? Okay. Yeah, close. Yeah, so I think that's it, I guess.
Great. Looks good.
Okay, awesome. Thanks everyone, and we'll stop the recording.